then we contact those fit personages, fit people who are struggling like we are to know God. We can be with them and help one another back to God's omniscient love. If you do not have that natural love in your heart, you cannot mix with them. That's God's law. You may feel the presence of God. You may feel the fullness of His love. You may want someone to have it as you have it. But perhaps they cannot have it because they have not cultured the natural love of God in their heart. The two do not go together. Ordinary love is different. But that unconditional love in the heart, when it's cultured, those who have it mix together, merge together, work together, lift one another up to the great fullness of God. Isn't that a great thing? But you cannot do it unless you have cultured that natural love of God in the heart. And finally, perhaps the greatest thing, or the thing which is most important to us, is this: that without the culture of that natural love, there is no peace. There is no peace, because you know ordinary love changes. Conditions change, and what's the end? Sorrow. Sorrow, disappointment. And so without the cultivation of that natural love of God in your heart, there is no peace. Life becomes unbearable. But the worst thing is, we cannot take one step. We cannot take one step toward the kingdom of heaven unless we have cultivated within our heart that natural love, unconditional love of God. And I will show you why in a moment. Remember, it is impossible. That's why the Bible said, if you have love in your heart, you are with God. If you haven't it, you are not with God. And that's why it's impossible to take one step toward holy salvation without that feeling of the omniscience, of that great love of God. Now, those who have that, they know one another. God says, my sheep know me. And so those who feel that natural love of God, they are attracted to one another. And that's how the humble devotee stays on the path back to the omniscience of God's love, to the greatest love. And so we must find this greatest love, because we cannot take one step toward the eternal kingdom of God without it. That's why it is so necessary, so important, that we find this greatest love. In Revelation, the second chapter, the 2nd to 4th verses, I want you to listen carefully. It says, I know thy works, and thy labor, and thy patience, and how thou canst not bear them that are evil. And thou hast tried them which say they are apostles, and are not, and hast found them liars. And thou hast borne and hast patience, and for my name's sake hast labored, and hast not fainted. Now God knows all these things. But it says, nevertheless, I am somewhat against thee, because thou hast left thy first love. We have left the unconditional love of God, which He has given us, and from which He has made all things. We've left that. Don't you see? That's the important thing. That's why the first and greatest commandment is to love God. Because we've left Him. We may do all the good in the world. We may hate evil and false prophets. But we have something to account for. We have left the unconditional love of God. We have left that. That's the thing which is so important. And that's why, as I said a minute ago, one cannot take a step toward heaven until the natural instinct or the natural love in the heart is cultivated. That's why it's so important. As it says in the subject of this lecture, finding the greatest love. Now this energetic tendency of the heart's natural love, it is the burning power of God's consciousness. That force can go two ways. It can go outward, it can go inward. When it goes outward, toward the senses, toward the muscles, toward the body, it becomes emotion. And you know as well as I do that sometimes in religious fervor they begin to jump and run around and yell and roll and so forth. That has gone into the muscles and they began to move and act. But when it's turned inward, when that natural love in the heart is turned inward toward the spinal centers and toward the brain, the thousand-rayed lotus, where God's consciousness dwells, where His love dwells, when it's turned inward, then it becomes devotion. Quite different. Quite different than that display of emotion. It's a deep, penetrating, satisfying, powerful feeling of God's omniscience.